Hello, welcome back. Today we get to look at some slideshows to introduce requirements engineering. You'll see the assignment already posted on Canvas. A bit of confusion last time about how the assignments work. So just to clarify, they're always on Canvas, the actual assignment for the day. There's always a text description above and beyond whatever I tell you here in the lecture. That's what you actually have to do, whatever it says there. So just make sure you read it carefully and follow all the instructions and turn in what it asks you to turn in. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll basically, before any given assignment, give you some of the background that you need to do it, but then actually, read the text and submit what it asks you to submit. Normally it's, again, just one submission per group, but I can read that part carefully too. And then some people forgot to submit their team name, especially the people who all named themselves after me. That took a while to figure out, so don't do that. Now that I have you grouped, it's not as important, but especially the first couple times whenever you switch teams, make sure you put everybody's names on it. All right, so requirements engineering. Chapter 4 in your textbook, if you've got it. What are requirements? Why do they matter? Let's look at that. I got animations. I didn't used to have these. So a lot of the time I'll skip over slides. Don't worry about it, but if you want to read through them in detail, I think this slideshow is like 88 slides long, and we're only going to cover like 30 of them. I have those up on Canvas as well, all the different slides from this textbook. Okay, so requirements are going to be broken down into functional and non-functional. We're going to talk about the requirements engineering process here, eliciting requirements, specifying them, validating them, and the nature of requirements is that they will change. So, requirements engineering is the process of establishing the services that a customer wants. So you all just won bids. You won a contract to develop software from some slimy car dealer, used car salesman kind of company that used some pretty aggressive sales tactics to get you all to drop your basically earnings, your profit down pretty heavily. But all of you have a contract to develop some kind of software now. The requirements step is basically writing out all the different services and all the different features that the customer is going to want from their system, and also writing out the constraints under which that system is going to operate. We'll go into a little bit more about what that means soon here. So your system requirements are basically descriptions of what that software is going to do. They're descriptions of the system services, and they're descriptions of the constraints under which those services are going to operate. And so this is usually a very important step in the software development process because it is akin to your final contract. So when you're designing some kind of piece of let's say real-world hardware, like if you're building a house, you would have a similar kind of arrangement, right? You would describe the house as close as possible to what the finished product is supposed to look like. And then you would expect that the finished home is built according to that spec. And a constraint in a house environment would be something like that it can withstand a storm, or that it stands for more than a year without collapsing. The different things like that, down to things like the insulation actually works and keeps the cold out, and different things like that. There are many different constraints we can think about in physical production as well. But in software, it's really hard to outline requirements the way you would in a house. So what is a requirement from a software point of view? Generally, that's going to be an abstraction. It's going to be a high-level abstract statement of a concept, of a service, of a constraint. And some of the time, we're able to make really detailed mathematical specifications. We're able to say something like, the software should calculate pi to the 14th digit or something. But that's going to be definitely the exception rather than the rule. It's going to be very rare for us to be able to, even for mathematical software, give those kind of detailed specifications. Software requirements can serve two purposes. They could be the basis for a contract, and as all contracts are, they're human creations, they're open to interpretation. Your goal as the two parties negotiating the contract, you and the customer, is to make that as unambiguous as possible. So you're taking descriptions of system services, which are abstractions, and then you're trying to make them as concrete and not open to interpretation as possible so that you don't run into disagreements down the road. The more both parties, the customer and you, have a shared understanding of all of the different terms in the contract, the better it's going to be down the road in terms of deciding whether or not you fulfilled it. So make sure that you don't write things in language that is vague, because language that is vague is how requirements are rendered, let's say, problematic in court or problematic in terms of you getting paid. The more specific they are, the less open to interpretation, the better. But nonetheless, any kind of statement of abstraction is going to be open to interpretation. So these might be the basis for the contract itself again. So they might be the basis for a bid, or they might be the basis for a contract. Our bidding process is already over, but in a more typical software bidding experience, there would be more kind of contract type discussion beforehand rather than this high pressure, very quick process that we had. Of course, we're pressed for time here, so it's also much funnier to do it the way we did it. But it's possible that you do this kind of contractual thinking both before you win the bid and after. We're going to do it primarily here in that after the bid phase. I'm just going to read this whole thing out because it's pretty good. If a company wishes to let a contract for a large software development project, it must define its needs in a sufficiently abstract way so that a solution is not predefined. The requirements must be written so that several contractors can bid for the contract, offering perhaps different ways of meeting the client organization's needs. Once a contract has been awarded, the contractor must write a system definition for that client in more detail so the client understands and can validate what the software will do. Both of these documents might be called the requirements document for the system. So think about that. We're talking about letting a contract, so we're talking about basically Company Co. posting those different contracts available for a bid. Now, Company Co. did not fulfill their obligation here. The descriptions they wrote are relatively specific, but there's a lot of interpretation there. It's definitely vague. So we fulfilled the first part that it talks about here. Company Co. defined its needs in a sufficiently abstract way so that the solution is not predefined. The solution is up to you guys as the winner of the contract. And several different contractors, that is you guys last time, were able to bid on those contracts, and all of you probably had a different vision of how the projects you bid on were going to turn out, because Company Co.'s descriptions are, again, really abstract. What is Frog Finder? Company Co. probably has an idea of what it is. You probably have a very different idea. Now you get to reconcile those things. Now, once the contract has been awarded, which is the step we're on now, the contractor must write a system definition for the client in more detail. So the client knows what they want, but only in a very abstract sense, and they've already specified that. Now it's up to you to try to come to an arrangement with the client, try to explain to them what they want in more detail, so that the client understands exactly what it is that you're going to deliver to them. And once you've delivered it to them, the client can look at your requirements document and validate that it does what you said it was going to do. So in a sense, the requirements document is going to be your description of the future software, but also your promise that it's going to work the way that it's intended. That said, that original document, that bid document, the contract that Company Co. Gave you in the first place, that's also part of the requirements documentation. And if you don't meet some of those vague and abstract requirements that Company Co. asks for in their request, then you probably aren't going to do very well in terms of getting paid either. So while you have to try to make this detailed document that describes what the software is going to do now, keep referring back to the actual bid that you want and make sure that all of the customer's needs in that original documentation are addressed. Make sure that you've addressed everything that they wanted it to do. And if there's something that's vague or open to interpretation, it's your job to reach out to the client and make sure that something that they've written in that original paperwork is included in your final detailed requirements description. There are two types of requirements that we're going to be looking at today. Then we'll show how requirements are further broken down in later classes. So today we're going to be looking at user requirements and system requirements. User requirements are written in plain English. Usually they've got some fancy diagrams and they've got some, some nice pictures. But the key to a user diagram is it's written in natural language, plain old language, as if I'm speaking to you now. No technical terminology, no mumbo jumbo. You're describing the service basically as simply as you can in terms of language. Sometimes the service is very complicated in terms of what it does, and maybe you need to refer to language from another industry. So I'm not saying that your description needs to be necessarily simple. It's impossible to describe something like the function and geometry of a tokamak nuclear fusion reactor simply, but you can do it in natural language, and you can do it with diagrams. You can do it without getting into physics and computer sciencey terminology. So those are your user requirements, describing the services of the system and its constraints again. Those are typically written for the customer to read, because they're written in language a layperson can understand. And then you've got your system requirements. These are going to be more structured. These are going to be more technical. These are going to be detailed descriptions of how to accomplish those user requirements, how to make the functions, services, and operational constraints of the system a reality. These are defining what should be implemented in specific terms, and these are going to be often part of the actual contractual obligation that you have as the contractor. So this is going to be something like it must respond within 45 milliseconds or something like that. It could be a system requirement. You would be obligated to make something that responds within 45 milliseconds. It might be something like the application needs to be compatible with Internet Explorer 6, then you need to be compatible with Internet Explorer 6. Those can be system requirements. We'll go through some better examples here. Let's look at the Mentcare health system. So this imaginary system that the author came up with, but I think all of the examples in the book are based on real systems. So a simple user requirement for the Mentcare system is shall generate monthly management reports showing the cost of drugs prescribed by each clinic during that month. Simple to understand, plain English, everybody gets what that means. However, in doing that, there are a lot of sub-requirements, complicated, more detailed things that need to happen in order for that to be successful. So let's look at some of those system requirements that relate to that user requirement. On the last working day of each month, a summary of the drugs prescribed, their cost, and the prescribing clinics shall be generated. See, this is much more specific. And the user requirement said that it'll be done each month. But we need to be more detailed to say when each month, what happens, what specifically happens on that day each month. So on the last working day, the last weekday, a summary is generated. The system shall generate the report for printing after 17:30 on the last working day, again specifying not just the day but also the time. We need to be specific about when it's going to happen. A report shall be created for each clinic and shall list the individual drug names, the total number of prescriptions, the number of doses prescribed, and the total cost of the prescribed drugs. So the user requirement said that the monthly management reports will just show the cost, but of course we want to see a lot of different information, and this outlines specifically all the information that we want to see and how that information is going to be broken down. It's going to be broken down by clinic. It's going to feature the individual drug names, how many, the doses prescribed, and then the total cost. So it's not just going to spit out a single number at the end of the month. That would be pretty useless. If the drugs are available in different doses, separate reports shall be generated or created for each dose unit. Another specific requirement there. Access to drug cost reports shall be restricted to authorized users. That gives you a security requirement. Who can access this Mentcare system? Who can see this monthly report? Well, only specific individuals. How shall they be restricted? Well, they'll be restricted by a management access control list. There will probably be even more definitions of how that works later on. So you can see that the user requirement, simple, easy to understand, and then it leads to a lot of different, more complicated and specific system requirements that you have to take into consideration. Now, who reads the different requirements? So your user requirements, which are in plain English and intended for your end customers, those are probably going to be read by the client's managers. Make sure that everything is good. It might be read by the people who end up using your application so that they're aware of its features. It might serve as a kind of documentation for that application. It's going to be read by engineers in the client's company as well, and make sure that everything's doing what it's supposed to do. And it's going to be read by people who are in charge of managing your contract, and of course the system architects in charge of designing the system later on. So remember, you're not implementing anything yet. That's going to come down the road. And when it comes down the road, those folks are going to read the user requirements to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. Now, those system architects are also going to read the system requirements, because those are also important in how they design the system and all of its different features. Likewise, the client's engineers are going to read the system requirements and make sure that you're fulfilling all of them from a technical point of view. End users might end up reading your system requirements depending on how technical their job needs to be. So a secretary that processes those monthly Mentcare statements might not be particularly interested in the system requirements there. They might just read the user requirements, but other users might need to read them because their job is more technical and involves specific functions there. So it depends on the end user. And then, of course, the developers who actually implement this system down the road, they're not as concerned about reading the user requirements as they are about reading the system requirements, which give them more detailed specifications of the different things that they're supposed to do. Next, we're going to outline stakeholders. That's another thing that you're going to do today, in addition to spelling out those requirements. We talked about a couple different examples of stakeholders in that previous slide there. So a stakeholder is basically any person or group of people or organization who is affected by the system in some way and therefore has an interest in the system, how it works, whether it works, why it works, what it costs, all that sort of different stuff would make somebody a stakeholder. So anybody that might have interest in your system is a stakeholder. And generally, that doesn't mean some dude on the internet who might be interested in seeing how your application works, although it might. We're talking about the people who your software actually affects. So obviously the end users who are going to spend their days using it, but also the people who administer it, the systems managers, the people who will ultimately own the software you make for them, maybe government entities in charge of overseeing your software, maybe lawyers who are in charge of overseeing your software, maybe managers of the end users at that organization, maybe people who are affected by the outcomes of what your software produces. If you produce a software that's responsible for, let's say, censoring certain language, as one of you won a contract bid for, that obviously affects a number of people. They are not necessarily the users, although I guess the software is being used on their systems, or though maybe not, maybe it's used somewhere on an intermediary, but nonetheless you could think of them as users. But even if they're not, software definitely affects them because it's censoring their content, so they would definitely be stakeholders too. They have an interest in it. It doesn't mean that you have a financial stake in the software. It doesn't mean that you're part of the organization that contracted it. It just means that you have an interest in it to some extent. So when we say system stakeholders, that's not the same thing as a stakeholder in the stock or in the organizational sense, where you actually have to own a piece of the company to be considered a stakeholder. No, we just mean anybody that has an interest. So in the Mentcare system described earlier, we've obviously got patients. They're not end users, but their information is recorded in that system. It's the drugs that are being prescribed to them that get recorded in the system. So of course they're stakeholders, and their primary interest is in keeping their information confidential, right, and making sure it's accurate. So they obviously have an interest there. Doctors, of course, end users who input the drugs. Insofar as they interact with the system, they probably at least input drugs somewhere. So they're part of it. Nurses also obviously part of it. Receptionists are part of it. IT staff that will install and manage the system are part of it. So that's just one example of how you can very quickly branch out to many different kinds of stakeholders. So today I want you to think of as many as you can. Try to come up with all the people, all the different kinds of groups who will be stakeholders in the software that you're developing. Medical ethics manager, who must ensure that the system meets current ethical guidelines. A healthcare manager, who obtains information from the system. Medical record staffs, who are responsible for ensuring the information can be maintained and preserved. I don't know, researchers who work on the medical records. Tons of different groups that you can think of who might have a stake at some point. And lastly, remember that we are trying to learn Agile software engineering in this class. And the requirements phase, the idea of producing requirements separately like this, is a little bit contrary to the Agile approach. A lot of organizations won't make this a discrete phase, or they'll rush through this pretty quickly because many Agile proponents argue that producing a requirements document with a lot of detail, like we're doing to an extent today, I mean, how much detail can you make in an hour? But anyway, producing a requirements document with a lot of detail is a waste of time because the requirements will change very quickly. And as soon as you start development, essentially the requirements document is going to be out of date. So keep that idea in mind as we go through this process. Your requirements document is probably going to need a refresh at some point, but try to come up with the requirements as you see them today. Agile methods handle their requirements in incremental steps, and they update them as they go. And Agile methods will also express their requirements often as user stories, which we're going to look at next time and do those next time. Critical systems typically will have a very, very specific requirements phase with very specific contractual obligations. So something like a nuclear reactor subsystem, that's not going to have one of these incremental changes to requirements, hopefully, or maybe like a NASA shuttle or something. They're going to be very, very particular about what they want and expect it to be delivered very precisely. And if there are changes, those can throw a serious wrench into the whole process. So those typically follow the model where the requirements are elicited like this up front. Okay, so that's going to be it for today. I'm going to let you guys get into it doing today's task. So figuring out those stakeholders, outlining those different requirements. I'm going to jump in as myself and talk to you, but if you want to talk to the customer, they're just a phone call away, so let me know. I'll see you in Discord.